this set of budget makers, the last couple of years, the bureaucrats in Parliament, in the Finance Ministry, and the Finance Minister have shown that they're quite conservative. I mean, if you look at the numbers which were framed in the last budget, it was like what we used to describe in the early 2000s about a particular company, which I would not name, under promise and over deliver. So they have put up very conservative estimates for taxation and revenues, and they've over-delivered, and over-delivered by a long chalk this year. So conservatism is the hallmark of this team that has been making the budget in the last 3 years. We saw it during the COVID pandemic when there were all-round calls for opening up the purse, but the government held steadfast to a conservative plan. And one would think that we'll see more of that this year, though the temptation will be to loosen the purse strings a little bit ahead of the elections next year. So it's a very interesting, budgets are always interesting, so it is a bit of a cliche for me to say this will be an interesting budget. But that said, I think there is a lot to look forward to here. Because we are entering into a high growth phase as a country, as an economy, we all know that. And we are looking forward to the government to help us forward in that venture, and certainly not up here. And I'll invite the next panel onto the stage. And but first, before that, we have the chief guest address by Mr. Niranjan Hiranandani. We look forward to hearing from him as an industry leader on what he thinks about the economy, what he thinks about the growth in this real estate industry, which is a very vital component of the economy.
Thank you very much, Mr. Raghuveer Srinivasan, for inviting me here to make this keynote speech. I'm looking at the kind of panel that you have. I don't know whether I'm the right person to make the keynote, but thank you very much anyway for calling me. My friend, Mr. Madan Srinivas, Sabnavis, and my dear friends who have come here early in the morning. We're now in a different world completely. Different world in the sense that we are seeing recessions all over the Western hemisphere. And on one side, we are challenged because we have integrated with the rest of the world. So our exports and other aspects are definitely going to be in difficulty. On the other hand, India has been able to manage a GDP growth of 6.2, 6.4. Different estimates have been given for growth, which is absolutely opposite of what the West is really doing. We have had a geopolitical situation which is unique for India, because on one side, we've been able to deal with the Western world, and on the other hand, we have been able to buy oil from, we have been able to buy oil from Russia, which has saved us 35,000 crores of rupees till today's date. And that has definitely helped us in taking a balanced view of what the situation is, wherein India has been able to balance both the ideas geopolitically as well as in the economy. I think this is a different thing. I would be corrected if I'm not incorrect, because I'm not too much into the capital markets, and we have people with great foresight, reputation, and working into that segment. The Western world has actually pulled out money from the capital markets. And the resilience of the internal market and the confidence of the people here has put up a balance which has actually brought up the capital markets. This is something I would like you to tell us more when you get onto the stage and give us an indication as to how these contradictions. I said first the contradiction that the Western world is in recession. We have been able to say. Second, that the oil which is coming from Russia saved us 35,000 crores of rupees till date. And this aspect of the capital markets which is there, which is very different. We're talking about a $5 trillion economy, which the Prime Minister has targeted. And our editor has just told us that I think that's an underestimation. I think we'll cross that. That is the belief that we have with our Prime Minister and the government of the day today, that I think that change is going to be there, which we have to see. But for making that target happen, there's a different view that needs to be taken by the government. And we have to target not 6.2, but we have to do a double-digit growth in terms of the economy. So if you want to achieve that, the double-digit growth is necessary for the economy to grow. So yes, we do have challenges, but we see that the leadership today will be able to achieve that kind of thing. So what are we really looking for? There are two angles to it. The first, the investment angle. And today the government has been able to do it in terms of investment, and this definitely needs to increase. And what are we saying? I think the investment should be double digit. But if you do a double-digit investment, you're going to look at the deficit situation that is really going to happen, because in spite of the fact that we have had growth in terms of tax collections, both in terms of indirect tax and direct tax, both have exceeded our expectations, we still have a situation wherein can we actually go into that direction? And why do we need to do that investment? We need to do two reasons. That one, that we need to increase the GDP growth at that level. And the second, which is equally important, is to see that the employment growth is there. Because it's not enough only to do an investment for GDP growth, but GDP growth alone is not necessarily going to increase employment. So another aspect which needs to be taken care of in terms of an investment angle is to pick up those sectors where employment rate has to be higher. So investments into infrastructure, into housing, into health, into education and tourism and textile industry, for example, as differentiated from all other types of industry, which could be capital intensive, but not actually employment oriented.
This panel discussion is going to be all about fiscal deficit and the management and so on. And we have a very distinguished and eminent panelists with us. Thank you so much for joining us here. So before I start the in-depth conversation, I'd like to throw one question to all the panelists. I'd like a very short 1 or 2 line answers from all of you. The question is, what should be the priority of the finance minister in this budget? Should it be to fiscal prudence, to try to contain the fiscal deficit, or should it be to promote growth? Have we come to a stage where the former takes precedence? So what is your view? What should be done? So I'll start with Mr. Shah from that side. Can you give a very brief answer? What should be the thrust?
Have you watched Bahubali movie?
Yes, I think we all have.
So you notice there the hero drew 3 arrows and killed 3 persons at the same time. Well, finance minister should copy it. Okay. Increase infrastructure spending, maintain path of fiscal prudence, and raise non-tax resources. These are not impossible things.
Okay, so do it all. Yes. Yeah, Ms. Sinha, what's your take?
So I would agree with Nilesh. I would say the government should try to achieve fiscal prudence while also promoting inclusive growth. So here I would say inclusive growth is very important, like Mr. Hiranandani was also emphasizing.
Okay. Mr. Nandi?
So I think this is a familiar question before every budget. Okay. Is it going to be prudence or is it going to be populism? And ultimately, economists write titles like, government does prudence with an eye on populism, or does populism with an eye on prudence, which essentially means that the eyes are working, both of them. Look, I don't think there's any debate as to between the two, right? But I think what will probably come out in this budget is what I'd like to call clever populism, in the sense that, we've already seen this for the food subsidy bill. The government decided to discontinue its additional free food program while making the current food subsidy program into a free food one. So you've taken, earlier a citizen was getting 10 kilos of cereals. That gets cut down to 5 kgs, but then this 5 kg is free for you. So this is one way in which the food subsidy bill is supposed to come down next year, despite being on the face of it populist, but yet fiscally prudent. So I think we are in a phase where we cannot compromise on fiscal prudence. But I mean, hey, we need to also take into account the macro political realities of this year.
Okay, done. So Mr. Sabnawis, what's your take?
See, I would tend to believe that this particular government has already embarked on a path of the fiscal gliding towards the 4.5% mark. So I think it's almost given that the fiscal deficit number will be lower than whatever is realized for 22-23. Now, this said, I really don't see the budget as being an instrument for bringing about growth in the country. I think growth comes from the private sector, and the government actually supports it from policy, which comes outside the budget. And whatever is possible within the budget is what is done. What we tend to exaggerate and say capex is going to drive the economy. Capex can contribute, but cannot drive the economy from the government's point of view. So what I'd really like to see here is that some kind of comfort provided to the middle class, the salaried earners. Because if you realize every budget, the finance minister says the conditions are tight, and probably the next year we can't give anything to the middle class. I think we need to wait for some more time. So if you look at inflation in the last 3 years, cumulatively it has been close to 20%. So I think there is definitely need to revisit these numbers and make sure that there is comfort provided. Because finally, I think when you give benefits, it helps the economy because it helps consumption. Consumption is something which is going to get retarded in the coming year because of high inflation. So I think that should be the focus of the government in terms of action.
Okay, thank you. So we have an overview now, so we go to the other questions. So let's talk about growth. So I'd like to address this to Mr. Sabnavis. Yeah, so the growth is of course the bedrock of all the budget numbers. So we'll want to understand what is the growth going to be for FY24, especially the nominal growth, because as we all know, the nominal growth of 15.4% in this year, it actually helped our tax collections and helped a lot. And we are expecting inflation to come down, so we won't have that maybe that comfort. So what is this, the inflation and the growth that you are looking for in FY24, and the challenges also, if you can just say a little briefly.
Yeah, see, in 23-24, we definitely expect economic growth to slow down, but I would tend to be more optimistic than other economists who are talking of lower numbers. I still think we will end up with a real growth of around 6 to 6.5%. So I think that's going to be the strong point. Ours is basically a domestic-oriented economy, and notwithstanding the fact that we have a recession in the West, while we will be affected at the periphery, but I think the intrinsic growth will come from within the economy. Therefore, I'm sanguine that we get 6.5%. Now, inflation, of course, is a tricky issue because we have seen that the base effects are going to bring down the WPI inflation, which is closer towards the inflation deflator, which we use when we get nominal GDP growth. But I would tend to believe that the deflator tends to be higher than the WPI. So while the WPI could come down to around 2 to 3%, I think the deflator will remain in the region of around 5.5%. So my take is that the number which the government could be using could be something in the region of 11 to 12%, which will be the base on which your tax revenue is going to be forecast.
So you're saying the tax revenue growth will be a little slower?
Tax revenue will definitely be slower because inflation actually has pushed up the tax receipts in 22-23. So if inflation comes down, growth slows down relative to the 6.8% number which we're looking for in 22-23. Necessarily, the tax collections, especially on the GST front, would tend to be low. We won't see the same kind of buoyancy.
Mr. Shah, can you elaborate on what the challenges, because it looks a little gloomy out there as far as the global scenario goes. So for the coming year, for FY24, just talk about the challenges that the economy faces.
So we are facing 3 challenges. One, our current account deficit is $100 to $150 billion more than what we can afford comfortably. Now, because you have reserves, you can do it for 1 year or 1.5 years. But eventually, this path is leading us to disaster. The second challenge, as Mr. Hiranandani mentioned, the consumption at the bottom end is impacted. The rich people and the upper middle class is spending. So SUVs have 1 year waiting period. But the lower middle income and poor people are impacted by COVID or inflation or both, and their consumption is suffering. And the third thing is private sector investment. It has bottomed out and picked up, but we need it to be at a much higher pace, much higher speed. And with capacity utilization above pre-COVID level, balance sheet getting deleveraged, this is the right time to accelerate. So the budget should tackle 3 immediate problems for India. Current account deficit, we need to control it and bring it down. Second, support consumption at the bottom of the pyramid. And third, accelerate the reviving private sector investments.
Thank you. So let's go on to the fiscal math itself. Ms. Sinha, I'd like to ask you, for the FY23, the year that we're ending as of now, so can you just walk us through the fiscal math, and what do you think will be the fiscal deficit number that we'll be reaching by the end of it? There were many pluses and minuses, as we know. And more importantly, what are some of the takeaways that the finance minister can take from the way the economy responded to the budget, last budget? So will there be some takeaways that she can again replicate in this time?
So before we delve into the fiscal arithmetic for FY23, we have to appreciate that FY23 was a difficult year for the government and for the government finances. Just when we were coming out of the COVID situation, we got hit by the commodity price shock. And we saw a very sharp increase in commodity prices because of the Russia-Ukraine war. And it had huge adverse implication for the economy, as well as, that put subsidy burden on the government. Our subsidy bill increased. The positive for FY23 has been that the tax revenue growth has been very healthy. So we have been recording gross tax revenue growth of around 16% or so. And even with the excise duty cut and customs duty cut, which was announced for some items in FY23, we are still expecting gross tax revenue to exceed the budget target by around 3.5 trillion or so. So that's a big positive. Now, if I look at the other components, non-tax revenue, there could be some slippages there because of lower dividend transfer from RBI to government. Disinvestment, again, there is a lot of uncertainty and we may not be able to meet the target of 65,000 crore. But on a net basis, if I look at the net receipts of the government, it would still exceed the budget target by around 2.2 to 2.3 trillion. Now, if I come to expenditure, on the expenditure side, like I mentioned, the subsidy bill has increased. So the expectation is that the overall expenditure could exceed by around 3 to 3.3 trillion in FY23. But when I'm talking about expenditure, I would also like to highlight what's happening on capital expenditure, what's happening on the quality of expenditure in the last few years. So if we see in the last few years, couple of years, if I look at the ratio of revenue to capital expenditure, that has been going down, and that's a plus. So from around level of 6 to 7 that we had few years back, in FY23 it has gone to around 4 or so. So government is focused on capital expenditure. Government had budgeted a strong capex of 7.5 trillion. In the year so far, we have already achieved 60% or so. So that's a plus that has been happening on the expenditure front. But net, if I look at fiscal deficit, it could exceed the target by around 80,000 to 1 lakh crore or so. Now, if I look at the ratio, like you mentioned, the nominal GDP growth has been higher at around 15% or so, as against 11% that the government had budgeted. So when it comes to the ratio, government will probably be able to meet the target of 6.4% or maybe 6.5% or so. Now, if you ask me what would be the key takeaways from this budget, which the government should look at replicating next year also, I would say this focus on capex, and especially capex on infrastructure sector. That has a huge multiplier effect, and we are going to see that over a period of time. And that is something which will also eventually, like right now we are talking about private sector not coming in. That private capex cycle not really beginning at the pace at which we would have liked it to grow. But this government's focus on capex and infrastructure would also encourage the private sector to come in. So I think that's something which they should replicate even in FY24, in spite of the limitations that they will have because of nominal GDP growth slowing down.
Okay. Thank you so much for that. Yeah, Mr. Nandi, we'll move on to the FY24 fiscal deficit now with you. So things are looking a little difficult. Consumption is slowing down. Maybe the corporate profits growth is also, the margins are under pressure and so on. And then, of course, the nominal GDP is coming down. So can you walk us through how do you see the fiscal deficit for FY24, how will it shape up? Because I think that's one number that all of us will be looking at the bond market, the stock market. Everyone wants some clarity on that. So tell us how it's going to be.
So FY24 achieving fiscal consolidation is almost like trying to cross a highway, because there's a lot of traffic that's going to come on the economy, on political side, and kind of reaching that fiscal consolidation at the end of the road is not going to be easy. Now, before I get into the math of it, I have a contrarian view to what Madan says on the economy. Let's look at when the US went into the dot-com recession or the global financial crisis, right? In both these, and mind you, I mean, our view is that the US will contract by 0.5% or so this time. Now, when we've had phases of recessions in the West, there are two sectors that got hit really badly for India. One is exports, and by the way, exports have already started getting hit badly despite a recession still not fully kicking in. And the second one, which isn't appreciated as much, is fixed investment, right? So as Mr. Shah was saying, you still don't have private capex really picking up much. And in the next year, if we indeed have a recession in the West, and if indeed there is so much of uncertainty, right, a company that might be thinking of investing, even if they have good balance sheets, might think that, hey, you know what, let me see how this plays out. Is this a one-year recession? Is this going to be more? Is this a U-shape, V-shape? Let's watch this out. So our view for growth is, real growth is around 5.1% for the next fiscal FY24. So that puts a nominal growth, which we expect the government will place in the budget, at around 10.5%. So one big risk is, this being lower. Now let's get to the math of what this actually means for the budget, right? Now on the, so let me tell the ending first, right? The ending that we have at our house, and I guess even the market seems to be gravitating towards, is a fiscal deficit of 5.9, 5.8% of GDP, below 6% of GDP. Now, my submission is that this is not necessary. So the government may very well announce this, and I think it's a welcome announcement. But to achieve this, the government would have to be laser focused on fiscal consolidation. And why do I say this? To achieve let's say 5.9% of GDP, one has to assume a direct tax buoyancy of 1.2. What this means is that the percentage change in direct taxes versus the percentage change in nominal growth. Now, if you look at direct tax history, and for indirect tax, one has to assume a little less than 1. Now, if you look at India's history, 1.2 for direct taxes and a little less than 1.0 for indirect taxes is normal. It's not something that happens in a bad year, right? So one, you need to cross your fingers and say that, all right, let's hope buoyancy remains somewhat healthy this year. The second aspect is on the expenditure side, right? Now, on the expenditure side, the government, as Rajni mentioned, there's been a huge overspend on subsidies this year. Not because the government was planning for it, but because of a series of supply shocks, price shocks, etc. So what one would expect is that the government would cut down its fertilizer subsidies, assuming that fertilizer prices are going to be lower this year. They're going to cut down on food subsidies. But interestingly, on fuel subsidy, the government has actually, the oil marketing companies have kept petrol and diesel prices constant for a long time. And the news reports one gets to hear is that a lot of OMCs are asking for compensation for under-recoveries to the tune of around 500 billion rupees, so that's 50,000 crore, right? So that fuel subsidy that was earlier around 50, 60 billion rupees might actually be much larger this time around. But if you take out the subsidy bit and you take out the pensions bit and all the sticky bits of RevX, the remaining RevX that remains the government would have to bring the growth rate down on that for fiscal to hold this 5.9% of GDP line, right? So overall, when I do a 5.9% of GDP calculation, my revenue expenditure as a percentage of GDP goes down from 12.9% of GDP to around 12.
So what are the other expenditure, like salaries and pensions? That's what you're talking about?
So this is not just salaries, pensions, you take that out. Okay. There's also the expenditure that goes in actually in each of the ministries, right? So at every ministry level, you would need to be serious about cutting down expenditure. And I'm not saying it's not possible. All I'm saying is that in a year where your growth is slow, so there'll be pressure for countercyclical, both fiscal and monetary policy. In a year where we've got a series of state election budgets, right? It may very well happen that later in the year, we might be sitting out here saying that, oh, well, NREGA allocations have to be increased, or the amount that goes through PM Kisan might have to be increased. And resisting that temptation has to be, you need to really have that resistance in order to maintain that 5.9% of GDP. Finally, just on CapEx, the government seems to, the news reports one has is of 9.5 trillion rupees. 9.5 trillion rupees is enormous. It's 3.1% of GDP. If the government actually manages to do that, that's actually going to be huge. So even a 5.9% of GDP number, I mean, my own calculations, I've assumed a 9 trillion rupees capex, which is around 3% of GDP. The only qualifier I'll put there is it's worth looking at what that 9 trillion rupees is going to look like. Because this year, the government's capex has been very strong, they've been spending high, but hey, 1 trillion rupees of government's outlay has gone to states in terms of an interest-free, in terms of a loan, right? A part of it also comes from, public sector companies that were below the budget being accounted for in the budget. So fiscal transparency. Now, it's obviously very good fiscal management, but what it means is that the absolute level of capex it's just shifting from one balance sheet to another, right? So it's not necessarily a boom. So that's the qualifier I'd put in terms of the capex. So I will, when the budget comes out, I think one of the things that me and possibly everyone on this panel would be looking at is not just the absolute amount of capex, but also what that entails. So let's pluck it out and see what it is. So all this put together, the government can achieve a 5.9% of GDP, but it has to be really focused to clear this bar.
Lokeshwari, before you ask the question, there are two things which I would like to issues which have been spoken of. This is, of course, we are all economists. Nilesh, of course, is an expert, so all of us have our own views. It's just my perspective. See, when we're talking of capital expenditure of the government, okay, last year they had 7.5 lakh crores, right? 1 lakh crores was actually transferred to states, which means that if states spent it, they would be showing it as their capex. So actually, realistically speaking, the government was asking for 6.5 lakh crores. Remove another 1.5 lakh crores which went for defense. So we're really talking of 5 lakh crores of money going for infrastructure. Now, if you look at the overall economy, for example, let's assume with all these growth rates, 273 lakh crores, we'll end up with, say, a target of something like 300 lakh crores of GDP for next year. 30% of that is capital formation, which is how much? It comes to 90 lakh crores. So honestly, I ask this question, can this number of 5, 6, 7 lakh crores move 90 lakh crores? And for so many years, we have been saying that if the government spends, private sector will follow. But private sector is not followed. So let's not get into this illusion saying the government spends, a private sector is going to spend, economy is going to gallop around, 5 trillion economy, now we're talking of 10 trillion economy. We're nowhere close to 5 trillion economy. Whatever that 5 trillion economy is being achieved is because of inflation. 15% growth in my GDP is taking me closer to 5 trillion. That's not the kind of growth we're looking for. So that's one clarification. Second, when we're talking of GDP growth slowing down, I'm going to counter what Aruti was saying. He's looking at it in a certain way, perfectly right. Economists look at it this way. If I look at the 8 sectors which contribute to GDP, will agricultural value added be affected by recession in the West? The answer is no. Agriculture grows because it has to grow. Monsoon is good, I get a good output, I get my 4% growth from there. Second, if you look at manufacturing, 1.6% growth last year. So we economists use this clumsy explanation, we know nothing happening, we'll say base effect. So 1.6 will become 5-6% for certain. Manufacturing grows, construction, Mr. Hiranandani is so positive about it. So construction sector should also be increasing. We're all saying the government is spending on affordable housing. Therefore, construction sector should also be increasing. We bankers feel the banking and real estate sector, which are looking combined, credit growth will slow from 15 to 12%. So I'll still get that buoyancy in growth in the financial sector. We all say that the government is pushing up the economy. So the public administration section, which should also be growing at a normal rate. So the only sector which could actually be growing at a lower rate is that trade, transport, where that pent-up demand is still going. All of us are going for holidays, all of us are traveling. So therefore, I feel talking of growth rates less than 6%, it is definitely an acceptable view. But I think that 6.5% real GDP growth seems to be very reasonable if I look at it this way.
Hello, everyone. We had a very interesting first talk earlier, and there were some interesting insights which we got, and we have a very eminent panel over here, and I expect that we would have a very engrossing talk now. You know, for the last 2-3 years, we have all been hearing about animal spirits and all that. And I always thought to myself, you know, what is this animal that we are, you know, thinking about, whose spirits that we would like to emulate, you know. So on that note, the topic for this discussion today is about spurring of private investment, CapEx. So it is an established fact that private capital expenditure has been low last 3-4 years. And we can see some areas where it is going up, where there is an uptick. So we will start with Mr. Bhatia. What do you think about, do you think that there is an uptick in the private capital expenditure? And how do you see it in the near future?
Yeah, I think to get a better understanding, it's important to de-average, you know, the picture, and then you start to see, you know, the peaks and the valleys. And particularly from the sectors that I'm coming from, so we are looking at mining, cement, captive power, sugar, and the related services part of it. I can say that there has been significant investment over the last 12 months or so, or even 1.5-2 years. And at least in terms of conversations that we are seeing in the market for new investment, it is as hot as it was. And definitely, I think the next 18 months are also looking very, very robust in terms of investment. And the drivers are different for each of these sectors. So if we look at mining, I think a lot of new mining leases have been auctioned. And there's also an interest to bring in more technology, whether it is in terms of in-pit crushing or, you know, modernizing the mining infrastructure that we have. So there's a lot going on there. If you look at cement, I think the investments that have been happening on the infrastructure sector are really encouraging the industry to get into investment in the creation of new cement capacity. If you look at sugar, then whatever we are seeing on the ethanol side really has had a wonderful impact on the industry, and there's huge investment coming in. And also what we are seeing on the chemical side has had a huge impact on the captive power space. So, so I think because of different dynamics, all of these sectors, at least that I'm playing in, are really seeing a lot of capital investment. And personally, we are also looking to, you know, stay in sync with that demand, because we are supplying the equipment, plants that are required. So I find it, from my standpoint, it's quite a rosy picture.
Okay. Raj, how do you feel about it in terms of fund flows and financing and all? Is it easier now to get capital?
Sure. So I guess, you know, I think the biggest positive for the Indian economy right now is that corporate balance sheets and bank balance sheets are exceptionally strong. Perhaps it's an unintended consequence of COVID, but and the fact that there has been a slowdown in capex for the last 2 or 3 years. But the fact is that we are at the back end of that. And when I look at the large corporates that we deal with, for many of them, their leverage is probably at an all-time low. which means that they're sitting on a massive amount of dry powder, which is available for them to go out and spend should the opportunity arise. What are the spaces where we've seen a lot of capex over the last few years? I'd start with the entire renewable power space. It's been a space where you've had multiple, private equity and infrastructure fund-backed platforms which have been set up, which have set up a massive amount of capacity. You've had very attractive exits for these investors, and when they're attractive exits, someone has made in a 3 or 4 year period, 1.7x their capital invested. That obviously attracts more investment. And you're also seeing the large groups, saying that, look, renewable power, green hydrogen, storage, these are all sectors that we need to focus on and we need to invest in. Second, the PLI-linked, Make in India theme. That's clearly a massive theme. People have fully realized that they were over-indexed on one country as a sourcing base for the world. And I think people are going to want to diversify, and that creates a massive opportunity for India. And I think some of the government policies have been particularly well-timed, whether by design or otherwise, to ensure that India is well-placed to try and tap that opportunity. And we're also seeing that in sectors like, for example, API production. India has traditionally been a strong formulations manufacturing space for pharma and healthcare, but API was not that big in India. Now, very clearly, people are saying we can't rely only on one country for API sourcing, so we are seeing a lot of spending in that space. And of course, the core sectors, which Vivek talked about, right, that's starting to pick up. Cement has always been a great sector in India in terms of demand growth has been very, very strong. I think the infrastructure push helps. So I think you will see a lot in that kind of a space as well.
Hetal, how about you? How do you see the private capex? How is it growing?
Yeah, I think at an overall level, if you look at past 5 years, on an average, India ends up spending around 2.5 to 3 lakh crores in terms of industrial capex. And a large proportion of that, almost 80% plus, is driven by private companies. What we have seen is a two-pronged approach from the government. A, incentivize manufacturing capabilities in India to have a strong manufacturing base. This incentivization is done either to bring about an integration of the domestic value chains or to become more export competitive. Both the objectives have been placed side by side, and that itself is going to now trigger incremental push to industrial capex. So if you look at the PLI incentives which are being provided and linked capital expenditure which is going to be spread between FY22 and FY27, you are going to see almost 15% on an average of industrial capex each year being driven just by PLI linked capex. If you then look at the kind of capex that is happening, it brings you to the point that Raj was mentioning, that almost 55 to 60% of PLI linked capex is in new age technologies or green technologies. So you are clearly seeing newer avenues which are being explored, which is in a way a push from the government to have better manufacturing capex in the country. Now if we come to erstwhile assets or old age economy assets, I think the trends over there are mixed, which is what Vivek brought out. Your industrial assets like metals, cement, larger players gained market share during the pandemic, and they were also able to manage cost much, much more effectively than the smaller players. So they have gone about for capacity expansions at significantly deleveraged balance sheets and good capacity utilization levels. If you look at the consumption side of it, whether it is two-wheelers or commercial vehicles or any of the services sectors like hotels or airlines, sweating of the assets is still not above pre-pandemic levels. Maybe closer to end of FY24, you may reach peak utilization levels for those sectors, and that's the time you will see capex actually picking up. So, it's a mixed bag for erstwhile assets, where industrials have also already started showing signs of pickup in capex.
So it will be a year more before you find some kind of a, spur in private investments.
Yeah, we do believe that you will see private capex seeing a healthy growth rate. Easily 15 to 20% growth rate can be possible. A, because of the PLI linked capex that is happening, and B, because of industrial linked capital expenditure clearly picking up. But the venues of spending are clearly going to be different. And you are not spending on old assets, you are spending to create newer opportunities. And that's where the differentiation in the private capex is clearly getting built out.
Thanks. Ashish, how about you? From the tax angle, I think it is a sticking point with everyone. From the tax angle, how do you see the investments?
So Janki, let me first close on the earlier question. Even if I look at it, if I look at it from the chemical sector, and picking up from what Vivek said, Raj said, even in the chemical sector, there are so many tailwinds which are supporting, capex in a very large way. So if you look at every company in India in the chemical space has been largely talking about expansion plans, announced those capex plans, and actually moving in that direction. Reasons are many. COVID, I think, was a transformative opportunity for the sector. Companies had to start looking at alternate sources for certain kind of chemicals, whether they were Indian companies itself who were reliant on overseas suppliers and now wanted to backward integrate to de-risk themselves when supply chains were disrupted in a different manner unexpectedly, to the entire growth trajectory, both domestically driven by GDP growth potential, which clearly exists. In a 1.4 billion population, chemicals are the building blocks for any kind of manufacturing. So there's domestic demand which is rising. There is import substitutions which are happening, and then you have the whole export potential in the marketplace, which is building out. So if you look at every large corporate globally is now talking about either a China plus one strategy, a Europe plus one strategy, for various reasons that have been discussed in the earlier panels. Whether you're looking at alternate suppliers to maintain the supply chains, whether you're looking at fuel costs rising in certain continents, translating into cost efficiencies and quality, which Indian manufacturers are now raising their bars, and really supplying at levels that global is very satisfied with, such that they are placing 10-year contracts now with companies. So we are seeing that confidence in India being seen as a manufacturing hub. So I think this is playing out apart from the tailwinds coming from the government support. Announcing PLIs, announcing a 15% rate company for manufacturing sector. I think these have been very positive changes which are now translating into action. Of course, there's lots that can be done, no doubt about it, and we can talk about it.
Input costs have gone down. How is that affecting you as a company and for the industry in general, especially in the areas where you all operate?
Yeah. Now, see, when we look at industrials related capex, then most customers are not looking quarter on quarter. They are looking, these are decadal kind of decisions. So you're looking at a capacity that you want to profit from over the next 10, 15, 20 years. And so these are very long horizon decisions. Where the focus really is, and which also links to what I think the budget should also look towards, is how are we really fundamentally making the factor costs for production in India more competitive compared to locations outside India, which might also be competing for the same capital flows, right? And that means looking at the cost of power, looking at the cost of steel that you can get in India from a capital goods perspective, looking at logistics costs, looking at how to simplify and make it still easier. I think India has made fantastic progress on the ease of doing business. How can we continue on that journey? So I think when those aspects provide more confidence, then I think as an investor, people feel even more confident to commit to being invested for 15, 20, 30 years kind of horizons with significant capex. Each plant is, it's quite a lot of money that goes into each of these assets. And that's where I think the focus should remain on this budget, because there's a lot of conversation I hear about, is there going to be some recession? in other markets, or consumption demand is not the strongest right now. But these are, I think, very short-term perspectives. Whereas I think, and we saw that in the last budget, there was a strong push towards capital expenditure, and I think that needs to continue. Infrastructure investment needs to continue. But what needs to come on top is really this emphasis on how are we increasing the competitiveness of being a manufacturer in India. And if we can bring that lens in, then I think India will start winning the battle with other global economies towards attracting more capital goods investments into the country. And we know for sure, I think, every time you invest in infrastructure, capital goods, manufacturing, then the spin-offs for the economy are so positive, both in terms of employment. Every dollar put in has a multiplier effect on downstream employment. Then also I think that creates a multiplier effect in terms of other ecosystems that you create around each of these setups. So I think that really has, if there's one thing I could give out as a message, then that would be that, look at the overall competitiveness of being an investor in these core sectors in India, and bring down these factor costs of power, steel, logistics. And then I think we have a wonderful recipe for sustained investment and economic growth on the back of these investments.
Raj, bank loans have become pricier, and you see that more people are going to the equity stock markets and all that. We have a very large FPO which is coming up. Do you think there will be more equity funding happening, or how do you see it?
So, ultimately, I don't think anyone goes to the equity markets because they think that bank loans are more expensive, because debt is always cheaper than equity, right? So from that perspective, I don't think that's the driver of people going to the equity markets. When the cost of debt goes up, the equity risk premium still remains, and the cost of equity also goes up. So I think, but this year, the way we look at it, given that people have strong balance sheets, I think people will go for an appropriate mix of debt and equity funding. We do see follow-on offers, QIPs. Last year there were very, very few. I would expect to see many more. You talked of the follow-on public offer, which is a rare product in the Indian market, but QIP is a much more common product. We do expect to see a number of those kind of deals taking place in the market. I think private funding continues to remain strong. Most of the private equity funds have plenty of capital, plenty of dry powder to deploy, and they'll deploy it when the right opportunity comes up. So that's the way we're looking at it.
Hetal, why do you think private companies have not been investing so far? And what would be the spur for them to do so? I mean, we've already seen that he has said, that there has been, but still it is slowing down. It looks like people are very reluctant, in terms of capital outlays. It is only in some sectors that I can see some kind of investments happening, but not in infrastructure. And infrastructure is the driver, actually, for the economy in terms of employment, jobs, and everything. So what do you think?
Yeah, so I think I'll take the last part first. You spoke about infra investments, and I think the previous panel also did touch upon infra investments, speaking about central government allocating around 7 lakh crores, you remove defense, state loans, and you will have anywhere between 4 to 5 lakh crores that gets invested. Now, if you look at pre-pandemic, which is FY15 to FY20, your average infra spend CAGR was around 20% plus. In the year of the pandemic, FY21, you saw a dip in government spending on capex as well, and FY22, you saw almost a 30% increase on that. Now, if you look at central government key ministries spent until date, you are seeing almost a 75% increase in infra capex that has happened. On the other hand, it is not the central governments only that drive infra capex. If you look at the total infra capex that is happening in the country, it would be somewhere between 9.5 to 10 lakh crores. This year, you may touch around 12 lakh crores. What we are talking about is central government accounting for 4.5 to 5, and then you have state governments which account a similar number, 4.5 to 5, and the remaining 10% coming from private players. The key is that the state governments have been very cagey about spending on infra. YTD growth in capital expenditure for state governments is a moderate 2% growth. So despite of government incentives of that 1 lakh crore interest-free loans or guaranteed loans, you have not seen state government spending. That is where the budget will need to focus, that how is the central government going to incentivize the state government that is an equal partner in infra spending to actually spend.
For more such videos, subscribe to the NewsX YouTube channel, hit the bell icon.